Molecular nanotechnology is often thought of as some sci-fi futuristic thing. Examples of its capabilities have been portrayed in fiction novels such as Escape from Furnace, in which experiments in an underground government facility transform ordinary men into superhuman soldiers with blood that had the capability to regenerate almost any injuries. It sounds like magic or myth, right? Well, the same as with ancient alchemy or the potions and mutagens in fantasy worlds like the Witcher series. They can improve your abilities and provide supernatural healing. But what if I told you that something not too far-fetched from this is already here hiding in plain sight? My name is Brendan Henry, and I'm a former engineer who has worked for Philips. I was on the design team of the Trilogy model ventilators, which are used in hospitals all across the world. We've tested these things in the most strict conditions you can imagine, and we had to build them with redundant circuits because these devices were important for keeping patients alive. Some of the engineers I worked with actually had PhDs in molecular biology and come from a family of doctors. So in those situations, you can just imagine that we have some interesting discussions and throw around some interesting ideas. And of course, when you're talking to people over a long period of time, you pick up on stuff. And so over the years, I've personally met a bioengineering expert, such as an inventor, who created a device which is implantable into your diaphragm, and it creates a voltage every time you take a breath. And this is currently patented, so I could speak on it. But this is huge advancements in the medical field, because it could be used to, for instance, keep pacemakers charged up so that they don't have to be surgically removed once the battery dies, which is just better for the patient. And these are the types of people I surrounded myself with. I later developed an obsession with using pharmacological interventions that include supplements and other peptides to enhance myself, but I was never satisfied with the knowledge that the current experts are putting out there. So I've even invested some money into some novel biohacking companies which were producing novel nootropics because I was just so interested in making advancements in this field. And as far as those other experts go, who routinely get information wrong, which is incredibly frustrating, I have reached out to them on some occasions and asked them if they could correct their stuff. I even offered to help write it for them. I was just all about trying to get the accurate info out there. But a lot of these guys just didn't really care about it, and so that's why I decided it's time for me to make some content, and I will set the bar higher. And by the way, if you're a guy who wants to increase his testosterone naturally, but you don't want to harm yourself in the process, check out our free report, Toxic Testosterone. It's on unyieldingvigor.com, and it shows the 6 most common supplements recommended by the mainstream, which are actually toxic, as well as some recommendations for what you should do instead. In his book, Engines of Creation, The Coming Era of Nanotechnology, Eric Drexler envisioned a future where nanotechnology would revolutionize human existence, but little did he know the future was not so distant and existed at the time he was writing his book. What if I told you there's a real-world application of nanotechnology that's already changing lives, even if it's not widely recognized? Would you believe me? I mean, if something was this good, everyone should know about it and be talking about it, right? They should be, but they aren't. The mainstream has almost entirely ignored it. In fact, I would venture as far to say that the mainstream experts do not even want you to know about this info. I think they want to gatekeep it so that they could have an unfair advantage over you. And I say this after personally being blocked from one of the leading longevity experts in the USA, just from posting a comment about it on one of his videos. And there's no way the most obsessive longevity expert I know, Brian Johnson, would not be using this, unless it is, of course, that he also just hasn't made the same discoveries that I did. So, what I'm referring to specifically are bioregulator peptides, which were founded back in the USSR. You see, these are natural products that were created for military purposes to give soldiers an edge, to slow their rate of aging and disease when working under extreme factors. More on that in just a minute. One reason why the marketing and the SEO on these discoveries has not been so good, at least in the West, is that these peptides are often referred to by certain reference names. For example, T38 is Visugen, which is KED, which is Liz-Glue-Asp. T33 is Pinolon, which is also known as the EDR peptide, and it's Glue-Asparg. And Chonlutin is T34, which is EDG, which is Glue-Asp-Gly, and so on. There are different names for all the Covensin peptides, and so you need to know to search by what name. But it turns out we have had a lot of science censored in Western medical journals. Covensin, a renowned scientist who has published over 700 scientific papers and 100 patents, and who is the inventor of this molecular nanotechnology, has said so himself in an interview. Therefore, I had to continue to search through Russian journals and his books, and I did this for all of the peptides I'm talking about. Both the reports of their use and the scientific literature regarding organ regeneration, enhancing cellular functioning, recovery after serious injuries, turning back the clocks on aging, and so much more have been nothing short of miraculous. And I'd love to share some stories with you today. But before we get into those stories, I would just like to answer a common question I get asked by my clients, which is, how do these peptides work? And it's a great question. I have not heard a good answer from anyone else in the mainstream on this, so I'm going to tell you. So inside every cell in our bodies, we have DNA. And this DNA is the written code that controls for every biological process that's occurring in our bodies. And part of what makes up this code is genes. So what activates and deactivates these specific genes are a few things. One is the methylation patterns, which are correlated with the aging process. So as we age, some CPG sites in the DNA change in a way that reduces the functional activity of our genes. And another factor is controlled by the histone proteins in the cell. These histone proteins wrap our DNA into a structure called chromatin, which then packs it into the nucleus of the cell. However, with aging, a type of chromatin called heterochromatin becomes increased, and the structure becomes more tightly packed, and when this occurs, it becomes less functional, leading to certain genes being either repressed or silenced. So, on the other hand, deheterochromatization involves reducing the heterochromatization, which stimulates those genes once again, contributing to the regeneration of cells and tissues, working more like it was when we were younger. So what happens when we take a bioregulator peptide is a couple things. First, this peptide enters the cell and it forms a bond with a specific type of histone protein. And this type of histone protein it interacts with is dependent on which peptide you're using. So this bond influences the chromatin structure in a positive manner. Many of these peptides can result in the deheterochromatization and enhance the expression of genes that are losing their activity, and stimulating genes that have been silenced as a result of the aging process, therefore having a positive effect on the cells. But these bioregulator peptides can also stimulate certain gene expressions directly by binding to the genes in the DNA code and the promoter regions, which is a region which affects the gene expressions either up or down, depending on the current state of the body and its needs. Now, a question I always get is, how long do these peptides last? Like, what's their half-life? And you can't really calculate this as it's a drug, because there's no pharmacokinetics involved in its metabolism, since it's directly binding to these histone proteins and the gene sites in the DNA. So what happens is that once the peptide bond is cleaved by peptidase, breaking the peptide down into individual amino acids, the amino acids get utilized by the cell for other processes, and once you stop taking them, you're still enhanced for a period of time. But how long that is uncertain. The gene expressions that were stimulated from when the peptide was bound are going to continue for some time, and what we have also seen in human studies, some of which have not been published yet, but the data has still been provided to me, is the reversal of biological age. You see, we have chronological age, which is our actual age. For instance, I'm 29 years old, but we also have biological age, which is the age of our DNA. And the most accurate method for measuring the age of our DNA right now is the Horvath clock, and it's able to measure the methylation patterns in certain CPG sites, which are the regulatory regions of your DNA which are involved in gene expressions. So it gives a more accurate predictor of the function and integrity of the DNA as you age. So I mentioned there are some stories that I wanted to share with you, and a really good one to put it in perspective is, I want you to imagine that you need a surgery. So say you have a health problem, a damaged organ, or an injury. Now the surgeon needs to get to the injury site, so the anesthesiologist, or in some cases the surgeon, if it's just local anesthetic, administers the anesthetic and grabs his scalpel from over there, carefully cutting through your skin, blood vessels, fats, fascia, muscle, and potentially small branched off arteries and nerves. Now this is extensive tissue damage, but it's needed to get to the injury site so that the injury can be repaired. But what if you didn't need the surgery in the first place and could be healed from the inside? Therein lies one advantage of this molecular nanotechnology. There have been many cases where a patient had a condition that was thought to require surgery, but was able to be successfully treated with these peptides. And these peptides have been studied more than any drug on Earth and have been in practice for over 40 years in Russia. It was basically made possible because during the USSR there was an unlimited budget and very high stakes. So it was in the 1960s and 1970s, during the height of the Cold War, that both the Soviet Union and the United States were deeply invested into military prowess. The USSR witnessed America's nuclear tests in action and was concerned about the proximity of the United States naval and military bases, since they were getting real close to its borders. And in response, they built nuclear submarines, and they stationed these near the US coastline. However, there was a problem. The crews aboard these submarines had to endure months-long missions, exposing them to high levels of radiation from poorly shielded nuclear reactors. And a similar radiation exposure was observed in missile silo operators and supersonic jet pilots, leading to signs of premature aging among all of these personnel. And so, even with adequate rest and nutrition, these men were not recovering from the effects of radiation exposure. And as you can imagine, a lot of them were probably also developing cancer. So, as a result, the Army Command instructed the medical force to find a solution for the complete recovery and to reverse this premature aging. And so the main issues identified were metabolic impairments, which was stemming from a lack of protein synthesis in cells, which, as you have heard, is something that the peptides can stimulate. And so this affected various bodily systems, such as the immune system, endocrine system, nervous system, cardiovascular system, reproductive system, and even the vision. And especially the immune system was hit really hard by this. And for anybody who knows how the immune system works, it's also regulated a lot in just your overall physical condition, even including your muscle mass. So these people were experiencing quite a decline. Their organs were deteriorating and failing. And Kovinson, who was a colonel at the time, and his partner Morozov later on, took up the challenge. So they were supported by the USSR's unlimited resources, as they were also concerned about the potential development of a laser weapon by the United States, which they were being told could cause blindness and hearing loss. And so this research was a priority for them, and it's likely not something that could be replicated today, since we just wouldn't have such significant amounts of funding today. Now, there's one physiologist who lived during the 1800s and early 1900s, and he was studying digestive processes in dogs, and he was awarded a Nobel Prize in 1904 for the physiology of digestion. And a lot of his work at the time was probably actually looking at BPC, or body protection compound, which is released from the gastric mucosa. And you probably have heard of it in regards to BPC 157, which is a fragment of it. And just as a side note later on, Kovinson came up with his own peptides for this, which are Stamicort as a polypeptide extract and Schonlutin as a single tripeptide. And these were even shown to provide complete reepithelialization of gastric ulcers, which were induced by H. pylori infection in 21 days. So they definitely do work, and it was even more effective than clindamycin in studies, which completely defeated H. pylori but didn't heal the gastric ulcers like this peptide did. Anyway, Kovinson and his team developed a method for extracting these peptides from various organs in cattle that were aged less than 1 year old. And since this is a question I get asked all the time, these are cattle native to Russia and had no documented cases of prion disease or infectious agents throughout the entire history there. That's why they only have used cattle from Russia ever since. And the extraction and purification process followed European Medicines Agency and pharmacopoeia standards, ensuring that the cleanliness and safety of the peptides was sufficient. And all of these peptides have a molecular weight of less than 5,000 Daltons, with the exception of Cortexin being less than 10,000 Daltons, and most prions are like 30,000 Daltons anyway. So these peptides demonstrated a restorative effect when administered to these individuals who were suffering from this premature aging syndrome. And it turns out the peptides were restoring the protein synthesis in the cells, as I mentioned, and although they were largely organ-specific, I found out through my research that they also exert effects elsewhere, but it does have an emphasis on the organ from which it was derived. And a good example of this is Schonlutin, that I mentioned above. It is a lung peptide that just happens to exert benefits to the stomach as well. And Pineolon, which I have done the largest write-up of on the internet, and even corrected Jay Campbell's misinformation when he called it the pineal gland bioregulator, which it's not, since it's isolated from Cortexin. And I can't remember which lady was talking about Pineolon, but she also gave incorrect dosing info and said it was in the microgram range when the actual patent for it from Covinson himself goes in a range up to almost 7 milligrams a day for a 70-kilogram human, and that'd be injected. Anyway, pineolone exerts a lot of beneficial effects on the muscles and endurance performance through stimulating PPARs and irisin, which increases the uptake of glucose into muscle cells and stimulates the utilization of fatty acids, thus improving time ran on a treadmill until exhaustion and preventing the drop-off in performance seen in a control group of wrestlers, and even improving heart rate power curves, which is the lowering of heart rate under the same power output. So, Covinson has 3 categories of these peptides. They are the cytomaxes, the cytomins, and the cytogens. Now, in Russia, they do an injectable version of the cytomaxes in clinic, but you can't really get to the cytomaxes in an injectable form online. And the cytomins are the equivalent of the cytomaxes, but with more of the cofactors and vitamins in them. And both of these are the organ-specific tissue extracts that I mentioned. Covinson refers to these as having a slower action time to take effect, but a longer duration of effects. So he recommends that in cases where you want to correct an issue quickly, you use a cytogen first, since they are quicker acting, and this just has to do with their smaller size, leading to a greater absorption and ability to pass into the cells and bind to their target sites easily and quickly. And so a cytogen is just a single peptide that was found through spectrometry examination in the cytomaxes. And it must be a di, tri, or tetrapeptide, so between 2 to 4 amino acids in length. For example, Vylon is a dipeptide, pineolone, chunlutin, and Visugen are tripeptides, and epitalin and bronchogen are examples of tetrapeptides. So generally you wouldn't just take one peptide for your goal, since a better effect can be achieved with using multiple synergistic peptides at a time. And in studies in humans, they have used up to 6 peptides at once. So if you start on a cytogen or multiple of them for an acute issue, you can then switch over to the cytomaxes for a longer term course. So these Covinson peptides all have human trials and decades of data supporting them. They can be used in various disease states and medical conditions, and actually I can't even think of any type of condition that you can't use the peptides in and where they don't show promise, because they show promise for basically anything. And I can get into some of this in future podcasts, since I just wanted to give a brief introduction of the peptides here. But if you're someone who wants to become a complete master in peptides, that's what my Peptide Masterclass is for. It not only covers all of the Covinson peptides, but all of the best peptides in general, too. I go deep into it, but also provide a bonus module in PDF for the guy who just wants to be told what to do without going so deep on the science. So whether you're that guy who wants to become a top expert or just figure out what's best to use as fast as possible, I highly recommend you check it out by going to unyieldingfigure.com. And some more history of the peptides use is the Kosmonauts Soviet nuclear-powered submarine, which experienced a fire in the Norwegian Sea in 1989, and it sunk. And many of the men on board were left treading water up to 90 minutes before being rescued, which was a true feat because I believe there was only 15 minutes that was estimated it was the approximate survival time when you're in those waters, just because they were so cold. So impressively, the survivors were able to make a complete recovery after being rescued with the help of peptides, and notably the thymus bioregulator is one that they used in this case. And so Covinson peptides have also been used in Afghanistan, in the Chernobyl incident in Ukraine, which was the nuclear disaster, in Gazprom workers in Serbia, and it was found to reduce their all-cause mortality over a period of multiple years compared to the control. In the elderly, to reduce all-cause mortality and improve the metabolic functions and conditioning of the elderly to a level that brought them back closer to that of a younger person. Although it didn't completely restore their metabolic processes back to a younger person, it was a significant improvement, also reduced their rate of respiratory infection, cardiovascular disease, etc. And this was just with 2 peptides, being the thymus and the pineal gland extracts. And so these peptides have also been used in Olympic athletes in the USSR, but even to this day, because they're not banned since they're just considered a food supplement. And in some cases, hardcore athletes can even have an increased biological age in relation to their chronological age, which is not good. And it's just due to the effects that years of hard training has on the body. However, the good news is that they were able to reverse their biological age quickly. In fact, they responded even better than the average person when it came to reversing their biological age, And I believe the reason for this is just that their starting point with the biological age was much higher than, say, an average person. And these people were otherwise healthy, aside from that one accelerated cellular aging. And so with the peptides, they were able to basically just reverse that age right back very quickly over a period of months. And like I said, these peptides have a lot of benefits and uses in sports, whether it's improving endurance, your VO2 max, your lung capacity, your heart rate, power curves, I guess that goes with VO2 max, improving your joint health, your actual muscle flexibility can be improved with them, as well as your muscle strength and just overall recovery ability. There's a lot that these peptides can do. And this has been Brendan Henry from Unyielding Vigor. If this podcast has been beneficial for you, consider sharing it with others. I'm sure it could answer a lot of people's questions. I used to get questions on Discord all the time, which were basically just due to a fundamental misunderstanding of how these peptides actually worked. And apparently there was a longevity thread also related to a lot of misunderstandings, and Reddit posts as well, and all that. So please share, and if you have any questions, leave a comment below. And be sure to subscribe and go to unyieldingvigor.com/resources and subscribe to our blog there as well. We put out a lot of great content, and thanks for listening.